From shadowy figures lurking in the depths of the Tokyo subway to a haunting melody that lures travelers into the German forests, every country holds its own terrifying secret. Stories passed down as whispered warnings, myths meant to scare children, or perhaps cautionary tales to protect us from something far worse. But what if these legends aren't just stories? What if they're real? Tonight, we're diving into the most chilling urban legends from around the world. But be warned, once you hear them, you might never feel safe again. And if you think these are just tales, wait until the lights go out. If you dare, share your own eerie experiences in the comments below. But remember, some stories have a way of reaching back. I've always been fascinated by urban legends, but I never thought I'd find myself in the middle of one. It started when I moved to Tokyo for work, excited about the city's endless energy and neon-lit nights. The Tokyo Metro became a second home. Its rhythmic clatter, the soothing hum of the tracks, and the comforting glow of station lights flickering past my window. But something changed the night I took the last train home. There's an old rumor among subway workers about the Shokosha, the Watcher. They say he appears on security footage at abandoned platforms, always watching, always waiting. Some claim he's a lost spirit, others whisper that he's something much worse. An echo of the subway itself, a presence older than the tunnels, feeding off the lost and the unwary. I used to think it was just another ghost story. But after what happened to me, I know better now. It was a long day at work, and by the time I left the office, the city was winding down. The usual neon brilliance of Shibuya felt dimmer, the streets quieter. I barely caught the last train home, sliding into my usual seat by the window, half asleep before we even left the station. At first, everything felt normal. The train rocked gently along the tracks, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I scrolled through my phone, my tired eyes barely registering the scrolling text. But as the train sped forward, I noticed something strange. The usual station announcement stopped. There were no other passengers in my car. The dull hum of conversation, the quiet rustling of newspapers, the occasional soft cough of a stranger, gone. I looked up from my phone and saw something that made my stomach drop. The train had stopped at a station that shouldn't exist. Outside, the platform was dimly lit, the overhead bulbs flickering weakly. The sign above read Kisaragi Station. That name, I'd never heard of it before. And I knew every stop on this line. A creeping unease crawled up my spine. Maybe I had dozed off and missed my stop? I checked my phone, but there was no signal. My reflection in the darkened window looked as uneasy as I felt. Then I noticed something else. A man stood at the far end of the platform, perfectly still. His posture was unnatural, stiff, rigid, like a mannequin that had been carelessly placed there. And his feet weren't touching the ground. The train lights flickered. In that split second of darkness, he moved. Not in a normal way, there was no motion, no transition. One moment, he was at the far end of the platform. The next, he was pressed against the train window, staring right at me. I choked on a breath and scrambled backward in my seat. His face was wrong, blurred, distorted, like a glitched-out image on a broken screen. His mouth twisted, lips stretching into something that wasn't quite a smile. The lights flickered again. This time, he was inside the train, standing at the far end of my empty car, unmoving. Watching. The air grew heavy, thick like molasses, pressing against my chest. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to look away, but I couldn't. Then, a whisper. Right behind me. Are you watching me too? A breath. Asterisk, asterisk, cold, damp, rotting. Asterisk, asterisk, ghosted over my ear. I spun around, heart hammering. There was no one there. The train suddenly lurched forward, the station disappearing into the void of the tunnels. I clutched the edge of my seat, my hands trembling. My reflection in the window stared back at me, wide-eyed, pale. I looked around the empty car, half expecting the shadowy figure to still be standing there. But I was alone. The automated station announcements returned as if nothing had happened. The familiar voice calmly announced my stop, and when the train doors slid open, I ran like my life depended on it. The city was normal again. Bright lights, distant chatter, cars honking in the night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. I told myself it was just exhaustion, just an overactive imagination. That's what I believed, until I checked my phone. There was a new photo in my gallery, a grainy image of me, sitting alone on the train, and in the reflection of the window, just barely visible, was a dark figure. Watching. What would you do if you found a picture like that on your phone? Would you delete it? Or would you check if he's still watching? I never considered myself superstitious. Ghost stories, urban legends, whispered warnings. I thought they were just that, stories. But one rainy night on a lonely stretch of highway outside Berlin, I learned the hard way that some legends are warnings. There's an old German tale about a hitchhiker who appears on desolate roads, always looking for a ride. Drivers who pick him up are never seen again. I had heard it before, but I never believed it until I became part of the story. It was past midnight when I left a friend's house in a rural town outside Berlin. The rain had turned into a relentless downpour, hammering against my windshield as I drove through the pitch-black countryside. No streetlights, no other cars, just my headlights cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw him, a lone figure, walking along the side of the road, drenched from head to toe. He wore an old, tattered jacket, his face hidden by the hood. He wasn't holding out his thumb like a normal hitchhiker. He was just standing there. Something about him felt wrong, but the rational part of my brain argued otherwise. Maybe his car had broken down. Maybe he needed help. I hesitated, then slowly pulled over. He didn't move at first. Then, with unsettling slowness, he turned and walked toward my car. I lowered the window slightly. "Need a ride?" I asked, forcing a casual tone. He didn't answer. He just nodded once, water dripping from his hood. I unlocked the door, and he climbed into the passenger seat without a word. The moment the door shut, the temperature inside the car dropped. For the first 10 minutes, we drove in silence. The only sounds were the wipers scraping against the glass and the distant rumble of thunder. I glanced at him from the corner of my eye. He sat unnaturally still, hands resting on his lap, face hidden in the shadows of his hood. I cleared my throat. "Where are you headed?" No answer. "Did your car break down?" I tried again, forcing a chuckle. "Rough night to be out walking." Slowly, he turned his head toward me and smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, stretching across his face in a way that made my stomach twist. His teeth were wrong, jagged, uneven, too many of them. A chill crawled up my spine. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. "You okay, man?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket. My heart slammed against my ribs. Was he pulling out a weapon? I tensed, preparing to slam on the brakes, when he pulled out something small and placed it on the dashboard. It was an old cassette tape. No case, no label, just a worn-out, dirty cassette. "Play it," he finally spoke. His voice was hoarse, broken, like vocal cords that hadn't been used in years. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to throw that thing out the window and keep driving. But my hands moved on their own, inserting the tape into the car's cassette player. The tape crackled to life. At first, there was only static. Then voices. Soft, desperate voices. Crying. Pleading. And underneath it all, a faint rhythmic sound. A wet, squelching noise. Like meat being carved. I slammed the eject button. What the hell was that? I demanded, turning to him. But he was gone. The passenger seat was empty. The door had never opened. The seatbelt was still buckled. But the cassette was still there. And it was still playing. I nearly crashed the car, pulling over. My hands shook as I grabbed the cassette and hurled it out into the rain. I waited, expecting something. Footsteps, a voice, anything. But there was only silence. I didn't sleep that night. I told myself it was exhaustion, a hallucination from driving too long in the rain. That's what I believed, until I looked at my passenger seat the next morning. The seat was soaking wet. And on the dashboard, the cassette was back. But this time it had a label. Scrawled in red ink, or maybe something worse, were 3 words. "Play it again." My stomach dropped. I didn't want to. But some force, curiosity, dread, something primal, made me pick it up and put it back into the player. The tape crackled to life. At first, the same static. Then the voices. The same wet, slicing sound. But this time, something different. A voice, my voice. I went cold. Where are you headed? I heard myself say. Then, a few moments later, my own voice again. You okay, man? It was our conversation from last night. But this time, the hitchhiker responded. Soft, distorted, like something speaking from deep underground. I never left. The air in my car turned suffocatingly heavy. My breath hitched. The tape kept playing. And then, I heard my own screams. Not from last night. Not from anything I remembered. But from somewhere in the future. A sharp, wet choking sound. The sound of nails scratching against leather. My own ragged breaths filled with terror. The last thing I heard was a voice, low, gurgling, and too close to my ear. See you soon. I yanked the tape out and hurled it across the room. My body was ice cold with fear. But the moment it hit the floor, the power in my apartment cut out. Plunged into total darkness, I stood frozen. And then, a soft, wet drip, like water pooling on my floor. I turned my head slowly, and in the faint glow of the streetlights outside, I saw wet footprints, leading from my window, straight to my bed. The streets of Mexico City are bustling during the day, but as night falls, the heart of the city takes on a more sinister tone. It's in the stillness of the night, when the city is asleep, that something truly terrifying roams the streets. They call her the Smiling Woman, a figure of horror who lurks in the shadows of quiet neighborhoods, her unsettling grin glowing in the dark like a beacon. They say if you make the mistake of locking eyes with her, you'll never see the morning light. It was a cool night in late fall when I first heard the legend. I was in Mexico City, visiting some old friends, and after a night out, I found myself walking down an unfamiliar, dimly lit street to get back to my hotel. The atmosphere was thick with silence, broken only by the distant hum of the city. It felt like the kind of night where anything could happen. The street was deserted. The only sign of life was the flickering light from a street lamp at the end of the block. But something caught my attention as I passed one of the alleyways. A figure. A woman standing at the entrance of the alley, facing me. Her frozen smile was the first thing I noticed. It was wide, unnaturally wide, stretching from ear to ear. Her eyes were wide open, dark, and unsettling. Her clothes were ordinary, but there was something off about her. Her entire presence sent a chill up my spine, and I found myself staring at her despite my better judgment. She didn't move, but there was something in the air, something thick and suffocating that made my feet feel like they were glued to the sidewalk. Her smile never wavered. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from all around me, I heard it. You are beautiful. I froze, unsure if I had heard her speak, or if it was just my imagination. But then, I know your name. I shuddered, but still couldn't bring myself to look away. Her lips curled into that impossibly wide smile again, and I felt my heart race, my throat dry. My body screamed at me to move, to run, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. Her whisper came again, softer this time, but still somehow louder in my mind. I know your name. And then she did something I'll never forget. She stepped forward. Her frozen smile never dropped, her eyes locking onto mine, and it was as if the world around us paused. I snapped out of my trance, my instincts kicking in. I turned and ran. My heart pounded in my chest, my legs moving faster than they had ever moved before. But the sound of her laughter, the sound of her sickeningly joyous laughter, echoed in my ears. As I ran, I swore I could hear her footsteps behind me, getting closer, even though I dared not look back. The sound was relentless. I turned corner after corner, desperately trying to lose her, but the laughter never stopped. It followed me through the streets like a shadow, growing louder and louder until it felt like she was breathing down my neck. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I reached the familiar street that led to my hotel. I glanced behind me for just a second, and to my horror, there was no one there. The street was as quiet as it had been before. My legs felt weak, my head dizzy. I thought I was safe. But then I heard her voice again. You looked away too soon. I stumbled into the hotel, my hands trembling as I slammed the door behind me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I told myself it was just a trick of the mind, that I had been running on adrenaline, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to brush it off, but sleep didn't come that night. I tossed and turned, the sound of that laugh echoing in my head. Finally, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke up the next morning, I felt different. Something felt off. But it wasn't until I looked in the mirror that I saw it. I wasn't alone. Standing behind me in the reflection was the smiling woman. Her grin stretched across her face, her eyes dark and cold, as she whispered one final warning. You will never wake up again. The reflection blinked. And I didn't. In the early 2000s, a chilling legend began to spread across Japan, haunting the darker corners of the internet. It was the story of the Red Room Curse, a malicious pop-up ad that appeared on unsuspecting computers. At first, it seemed like an innocent, albeit strange, advertisement. But anyone who saw it was doomed. The ad would ask a simple yet eerie question. Do you like the Red Room? If you clicked yes, your fate was sealed. And when they found you, you were already dead. I first heard about the Red Room Curse from an online forum. A user had posted a story, claiming that they had encountered the dreaded pop-up ad. At first, I didn't believe it. After all, it sounded like just another urban legend. A story designed to scare people into avoiding random links or suspicious websites. But then I started to see strange things happening to my friends. One by one, they vanished. The first was Hiroshi, a guy I had met in a gaming chat room. He had been a regular user on the forum, always joking around. But one evening he logged off and never came back. We tried messaging him, but his account was suddenly deactivated. A few days later, we found out that Hiroshi's body had been discovered in his apartment. He had been found locked in his room, with no signs of forced entry. His face was frozen in terror, and his body was covered in his own blood. The walls were smeared with crimson marks, and the furniture was overturned as though he had been in the midst of a struggle. The police called it an unnatural death, something beyond their understanding. But we all knew the truth. Hiroshi had been claimed by the Red Room Curse. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, but the more I heard, the more I began to believe. The same thing happened to Yuki, another friend from the forum. She was a programmer, sharp, logical, never one to fall for superstitions. But one day, she sent a frantic message to our group chat. Guys, I saw it. The Red Room. It's real. That was the last message we received from Yuki. A few days later, Yuki's body was found, just like Hiroshi's. Her apartment was locked from the inside, and once again, the room was covered in blood. The walls were adorned with strange, almost ritualistic patterns, marks that had been made by her own hands in the final moments of her life. As the days passed, the fear of the Red Room Curse spread like wildfire. More of our friends started to disappear, one after the other. Each time, the story was the same. A locked room, a bloody death, and a final warning written on the walls. Do you like the Red Room? I couldn't escape the feeling that I was next. The question haunted me. It seemed impossible to avoid. I would be browsing the internet, just like I always had, and suddenly a pop-up would appear. Do you like the Red Room? Each time, my heart would stop, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. It felt like the walls were closing in. But each time, I would quickly close the window, telling myself I could outrun the curse. But one night, it was different. The pop-up came, just like it had before. But this time, I didn't close the window. Something inside me clicked. I couldn't run anymore. I clicked the pop-up, and the screen went black. I woke up in a room I didn't recognize, cold sweat dripping down my face. The walls were painted in a deep, dark red, my own blood. The door was locked. I was trapped. The walls seemed to pulse as if alive, like they were closing in on me. I heard it then, the whisper. Do you like the Red Room? I could barely breathe. The air was thick, suffocating. I turned to the corner of the room, and there it was, the screen. The same question, glowing in the dim light. Do you like the red room? And in that moment, I realized the curse wasn't just a pop-up ad. It was a trap, pulling in anyone who believed it was just an urban legend. It wasn't enough to avoid it, you had to ignore it. If you acknowledged it, it would claim you. No one had escaped. I screamed, but there was no one there to hear. The red room had claimed me too. Deep in the heart of Germany lies the Black Forest, a place known for its eerie beauty, ancient trees, and dark legends. The locals whisper about the singing trees, a terrifying phenomenon that lures lost travelers deeper into the forest. The melody that drifts from the trees isn't a song of joy. It's a warning, a call that promises only one thing: never being seen again. But the song is so hauntingly beautiful, so irresistible, that many wanderers are drawn in, unable to resist the pull of the melody. And those who do are never heard from again. I was traveling through Germany, a solo backpacker hoping to find adventure and a sense of peace in nature. I had heard whispers about the Black Forest, of course, but like most, I dismissed the stories as nothing more than local folklore. After all, the world had changed, hadn't it? Modern technology, GPS, and the knowledge of the world at our fingertips. It seemed impossible to get lost anymore. But on the day I decided to visit the Black Forest, something felt different. The sun hung low in the sky as I ventured into the forest, the towering trees blocking out the light. The air was thick with the scent of moss and damp earth, the only sounds being the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional bird call. I was surrounded by stillness, an unnatural silence that seemed to press down on me, suffocating. I wandered deeper into the woods, following a narrow trail, but soon the path seemed to disappear. The trees stood like silent sentinels, casting long shadows across the ground. The only direction was forward. It was then that I heard it, a soft melodic tune drifting on the wind. It wasn't a song that should have belonged to the forest. It sounded human, almost like a lullaby, with a haunting beauty that made my skin prickle. The sound seemed to come from deeper within the trees. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I walked further, the melody grew louder. It was as if the forest itself was calling me. A strange, magnetic pull urged me to follow the sound, to venture deeper into the woods. My feet moved on their own accord, the pull of the song growing stronger with every step. The trees around me were ancient, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted fingers. The melody was clearer now, almost like it was right in front of me, yet there was no one there. I came upon a small clearing, where the light from the setting sun filtered through the dense canopy, casting an eerie glow on the forest floor. And there, in the center of the clearing, was a massive tree. Its bark was dark and twisted, and its branches seemed to sway in rhythm with the song, as if alive. I couldn't resist any longer. The song wrapped around me like a warm embrace, pulling me closer to the tree. As I stepped forward, I saw something in the shadows, figures ghostly and translucent, standing beneath the tree. Their faces were distorted with pain, their eyes empty and hollow. They were the ones who had come before me, lost souls drawn to the song, never to return. But I couldn't stop. I was mesmerized. My body moved without my control, my feet dragging me toward the tree. The figures reached out to me, their hands cold and clammy, pulling me closer to the heart of the forest. The song was growing louder now, the melody twisting, becoming more frantic, as if something was warning me. I looked back one last time, but the path I had walked on had disappeared. There was no way out. The last thing I remember was the faces of the lost travelers, their eyes pleading with me to turn back. But it was too late. The song had claimed me. When the authorities finally searched the Black Forest, weeks later, they found no trace of me. No footprints. No belongings. The only thing they found was the haunting melody that still echoed in the trees. And with it, the faded, almost imperceptible question. Do you hear the song? They say if you listen carefully enough, the melody will call to you too, luring you deeper into the heart of the Black Forest, where the trees are waiting and the song will never stop. In the cobbled streets of Edinburgh, Scotland, where history lingers in the mist, there's a legend whispered among locals. It's about a woman, a Victorian figure, dressed in dark, old-fashioned clothing, wandering the narrow alleyways and foggy streets at night. She approaches unsuspecting tourists with a simple request, to help her find her lost son. But there's a sinister twist to this request. No one who has followed her has ever returned. The woman is known only as the Whispering Woman of Edinburgh, and her voice is as haunting as her presence. She doesn't just ask for help. She lures you into her world, and once you're there, there's no escape. I had always been fascinated by the old, winding streets of Edinburgh. The city has a rich history, a dark past, and an eerie charm that makes it feel like you're stepping into another time. I was visiting as part of a solo trip, hoping to soak in the atmosphere, enjoy the ancient architecture, and perhaps discover a few hidden stories. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the fog rolled in, blanketing the streets in an almost suffocating silence. I was near the Royal Mile when I first saw her. At first, she appeared as a shadow in the distance, a woman in Victorian-era clothing, her silhouette framed by the mist. As I got closer, I could make out her pale face and long, dark hair that seemed to sway despite the lack of wind. Her presence was unsettling, but I didn't think much of it at first. She stepped into my path, her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. "Excuse me, sir," she whispered in a soft, almost musical voice. "Have you seen my son?" I blinked, taken aback. Her voice was delicate, almost sorrowful, but there was something strange about it. She didn't look like a tourist, and the look in her eyes, desperate yet distant, felt wrong. "My son, he's lost in the streets," she continued, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. "Please, could you help me find him?" I hesitated. Something about her seemed off, something that gnawed at the back of my mind. But I couldn't ignore the desperation in her voice. "Please, he's just a boy," she pleaded again, her gaze piercing into me. Against my better judgment, I nodded. I told her I would help. She turned and began walking, and without thinking, I followed. We moved through the twisting alleys of Edinburgh, deeper into the shadows where the lanterns barely illuminated the cobblestones. As I walked behind her, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led somewhere I shouldn't be. The streets seemed quieter, the fog thicker. And then, without warning, the woman stopped. "He's close now," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. I looked around, but there was nothing. No sign of a child, no sound of footsteps. The streets were eerily still. I turned back, but the woman had disappeared. She was gone. Panic rose in my chest. I called out, but there was no reply. The fog had thickened, and I was completely disoriented. The alleys were winding and unfamiliar. How had I gotten so deep into this part of the city? Then I heard it, a faint whisper carried by the wind. "Help me." I froze. It was her voice again, and it was coming from behind me. I turned quickly, but the woman was nowhere to be seen. I turned again, and that's when I noticed the shadows. Figures shifting, moving, lined the alley walls. They were watching me, waiting. I could hear them whispering, their voices rising in intensity. And then I understood. The whispering woman hadn't just led me here. She had led me to the shadows of the forgotten. I had followed her into a place where the lost souls wander, never to return. The next thing I knew, I was back in the center of the city. It was as if I had been transported. Time lost, memories shattered. My heart was racing, my hands trembling, and the air felt cold. The streets were now bustling with people, as though nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been somewhere else, somewhere dark and suffocating. I walked away, my thoughts scattered, but something in the back of my mind kept repeating. The woman. Her son. The alley. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was wrong. I had been too close. And no one who followed her had ever returned the same way. I never spoke about the woman to anyone, but that night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard her voice again, echoing in my mind. "Have you seen my son?" But I knew now it wasn't a question. It was a warning. Anyone who followed her would join the ranks of the lost. And there was no escaping once you stepped into her world. The Whispering Woman of Edinburgh still wanders those foggy streets, waiting for the next lost soul to heed her call. And those who follow her never return. The mighty Ganges River, revered and feared, winds its way through India, carrying with it ancient secrets and dark tales. Beneath its surface, many say, are the souls of the drowned maidens, women who perish tragically, their lives cut short by grief and fate. As night falls, their mournful wails rise from the riverbanks, echoing the lost lives of their children. But there is something more terrifying about these cries. It is not just a cry for help. It's a warning. The women call out to the living, their spectral forms drifting through the night air, looking for those foolish enough to approach. And those who do are never seen again, pulled into the depths of the Ganges to join the eternal mourning beneath the surface. I was on a journey through India, a country teeming with history, spirituality, and stories that seemed to bleed into every corner of the land. One evening, I found myself along the banks of the Ganges River, just outside the city of Varanasi, one of the oldest cities in the world. The air was thick with humidity, and the sky had dimmed to a dusky purple, giving the river an otherworldly glow. Pilgrims were still bathing in the sacred waters, washing away their sins, while others stood silently on the ghats, lost in prayer. The atmosphere was tranquil, serene, almost magical, until the wind shifted. It was subtle at first, just a soft whisper that tugged at the edges of my senses. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, I noticed something strange. A soft, keening wail echoed through the air. It sounded like a woman in deep sorrow, a cry so heart-wrenching it seemed to come from the very soul of the river itself. At first, I thought it was just the wind, carrying the voices of distant mourners. But then the cry came again, closer this time. I turned toward the river, where the shadows of the night had begun to stretch longer, and that's when I saw her. A figure stood near the water's edge, a woman dressed in a flowing white sari, her hair tangled and damp. She stood motionless, gazing out over the water as the wails continued to rise, becoming more frantic. There was a sense of grief that hung in the air, so thick I could almost feel it settle over me like a suffocating fog. I stepped closer, my curiosity overcoming my caution. The woman turned slowly, her face pale, her eyes wide with a sorrow that seemed impossible to describe. She didn't speak, but the silence between us was deafening. Then a voice, soft but desperate, whispered through the air. "My child lost to the river, come to me." It wasn't just her voice. There were others. More wailing voices, mothers, sisters, daughters, echoing across the water. All of them crying for lost children, all of them calling me. I felt a pull in my chest, as if I, too, had lost something precious to the river. The soft lapping of the water grew louder, almost hypnotic, as if the very river was speaking to me, inviting me to join them. I took another step toward the woman, my feet moving on their own. The pull was unbearable now. The cries of the women seemed to resonate with something deep inside me, a need to ease their suffering, to join their eternal grief. And then, out of nowhere, a cold, bony hand grabbed my wrist. I yanked back in panic, but before I could react, a second hand, just as cold, clutched at my ankle, pulling me toward the water. I looked down and saw more figures, silhouettes of women, their bodies half submerged in the water, their eyes dark and hollow. They were dragging me into the river, their grip like iron, their cold whispers filling my ears. "Join us, the water is your home now." I struggled, but their grip was unrelenting. My body was growing heavier, as if the weight of the river was dragging me down, into the darkness below. The surface of the water seemed to shimmer with the reflection of countless faces, the lost souls of the drowned maidens, waiting for their next victim. The last thing I remember was the water closing over my head, the cold, suffocating embrace of the Ganges pulling me deeper into its depths. But just as I thought I would drown, I was pulled back, out of the water, gasping for air, the figures disappearing like smoke. I don't know how I escaped. All I remember is the feeling of being watched, the weight of 1,000 mournful eyes following me as I stumbled away from the river. When I returned to my hotel, I found that the night had passed. Hours had slipped away without me even realizing. And when I looked in the mirror, I saw something disturbing. My face was pale, and there were strange, wet marks on my clothes, like hands that had gripped me with icy fingers. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, but I knew this. The drowned maidens are real. And they are waiting for those who stray too close to the Ganges at night, their wails echoing across the water, drawing the living into their watery graves. Some stories are meant to be left untouched, and this one is best left in the depths of the river, where it belongs. As we close the final chapter of these 7 creepy urban legends from around the world, you can't help but feel that unsettling chill lingering in the air, like a shadow just out of sight. From the wails of the drowned maidens in India to the whispers of the smiling woman in Mexico City, these legends are more than just stories. They're warnings. They're reminders of the darkness that may be closer than we think, waiting in the corners of our world, hiding in plain sight. But before you go, ask yourself, what do you believe? Could these tales be rooted in truth? Or are they just the stuff of nightmares? Maybe you'll encounter one of these legends, or maybe you'll be the next to become part of them. If you've made it this far, you're already too deep to back out now. Don't forget to hit that like button if these stories sent shivers down your spine. And leave a comment telling me which legend creeped you out the most. Have you ever heard something like this before? Or maybe you've experienced something eerie yourself. Share your thoughts and stories below. And remember, keep your lights on, because you never know when the next urban legend might be watching. Subscribe for more spine-chilling tales that will leave you questioning the shadows around you. Until next time, stay safe and stay aware. You never know what's out there waiting.